First, I want to thank Andrei and Veronica and Shestov for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. I'm happy to be with all of you. I'm happy to be in Uzhgorod for the first time. I'm kind of amazed I managed to get here, to organize things, to escape from the States. And I'm happy to be talking about Central Europe. As I said yesterday, I'm somewhat amazed at how often I'm asked to talk about what Central Europe means as the only non-Central European in these conversations. But I'm especially happy to be talking about this here because as Shestov mentioned yesterday, I'm kind of a neurotic catastrophist by inclination and am always feel like we're in apocalyptic times and the world is hanging by a slender thread and can end at any moment. And when I talk to Shestov, and especially when I hang out in Krasnogruda, I start thinking that maybe it's possible to save it. Maybe there's some, maybe that bridge can be built. Maybe enough bridges can be built. Maybe there's some way that we can do something. And I cling to that constantly, that idea that we don't have to give up. I was just maybe 6 weeks ago, I was in Kiev and at the Kiev Security Forum, which was already kind of funny because, as my husband mentioned, when they start inviting you to the security forum, then they're really out of new ideas and kind of desperate because you're the least practical person I know. But which is very fair. And I was on this panel about the contribution of Central Europe, to the war in Ukraine and what Central Europe can bring. And I was also asked to start there, and I also started off by saying that, I don't really have a right to speak. I'm American. And Sławek Szyrakowski was sitting next to me on that panel, and he immediately claimed me as his adopted sister, which made me then Central European by adoption. So maybe I'll keep going with Sławek's older sister role. So Kundera's essay. So I have been reading Kundera for a very long time. I started reading Kundera in the early 1990s when I was quite young. So that text has been with me a long time. And I've taught that text and I've thought about that text. And in some ways, my life has been bound up with it. It strikes me there's something about it that's very arrogant. There's something about it that's very Eurocentric in a way that is typical for European philosophy. When I teach Hegel and Husserl and Heidegger, their idea of world history is essentially ancient Greece, a brief epilogue in ancient Rome, fast forward to the French Revolution, and then an intellectual culmination in German philosophy, and the rest basically doesn't have very much of a meaning. And Jan Patočka, even though he was Czech, actually absorbed quite a lot of that. And Husserl's Eurocentrism, this idea of Europe as the telos of reason, as the place where it played out, there was a complete conflation of the European and the universal. And I think you see that in Kundera a lot too. And it's what I want to start off by talking about in this idea of the fantasy of Central Europe. I'm now confused because I like to look at people when I talk, but you're now on different sides of the table, so I'll try to keep turning around so I can see everybody. My usual method is to look at people, and when they look bored or confused, to adjust accordingly. This idea of Europe, only more so, of the greatest diversity within the smallest space, is a kind of Hegelian fantasy of Aufhebung, of overcoming, of the magical synthesis of all differences so that they are simultaneously preserved and taken to a higher universal level. Which strikes me as a very Hegelian fantasy of reconciliation between the universal and particular. And in the next few minutes, I guess, I want to talk about two fantasies of reconciliation, one between the particular and the universal, and one between the empirical and the ideal, and how those play out in Kundera's essay. And I should say I'm very empathetic to fantasies of reconciliation. We all have fantasies of reconciliation, and that's why Hegel is so seductive, and that's why it's so hard to get away from Hegel, because that idea that ultimately we'll move through time, and somehow these edges are going to be sublated and aufgehoben and taken to a higher level. It's very, very hard to get rid of that fantasy. I find it hard for myself too. Foucault has this beautiful passage in Discourse on Language where he says, but we have to ask ourselves whether all of our attempts to get beyond Hegel and to get away from Hegel are just one of Hegel's tricks directed against us. And at the end of the path, he kind of stands there gazing at us and laughing. And I always think about that. But I think one of Kundera's fantasies here was Central Europe with its veneration of Kultur, against Russia with its violence and brutality, was the fantasy that the aesthetic would be a kind of dialectical overcoming of the brutality. And I'm thinking about Robert Musil's novel, the Confusions of Young Torless, it is in English, Die Verwirrungen des Soldling Torres. I'm sure Yurko knows this book better than I do, because he knows Musil much better than I do. But what strikes me about that book, which is set in a boarding school, which is a very brutal story of a kind of Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age novel, which Yurko could describe to you better, but these teenage boys essentially brutalizing and torturing one another, including sexually. And at the end of the book, you kind of fast forward to adulthood, and the sensual that had been bound up with violence in youth is overcome by the aesthetic. It's kind of dialectically overcome and taken to this higher plane. And I think of that as kind of as an example or a metaphor of Kundera's fantasy of Central Europe, this aesthetic that can dialectically overcome the violence of sensuality, which is a very appealing fantasy. In some ways, I'm all in favor of it. Patočka very much shared this idea of Europe as this distilled special place where reason plays out to a dialectical conclusion, but felt that after the two world wars, Europe was dead. And the philosophy that he works on in the later decades of his life has to do with how to reconcile oneself, to this world in which Europe is dead, and what then happens to truth and what happens to reason. And he had this idea that the mistake that Marx and Hegel made was to believe that alienation could be dialectically overcome. One of my favorite moments in Patočka is from spring of 1948, when the Stalinists take power in Czechoslovakia, and people are being thrown in prison and tortured, and show trials are being set up. And Patočka is sitting at his desk, and he is rereading Marx and Hegel and making notes to himself in his diary. And you can follow in his diary what he's reading kind of day by day. And he has these notes where he says, well, Marx and Hegel correctly understand that the great problem of modernity is the problem of alienation. The mistake they make is to misinterpret alienation as a lack of wholeness, as something that can be dialectically overcome, as a gap that can be filled in. Because what alienation really is not a lack of completeness or an absence of wholeness that can be healed. Alienation is the fact that man is always other to himself, the impossibility of being self-identical, of fully inhabiting our own subjectivity. And that wound, Patočka says, that otherness to ourself, that is irremediable. That wound can never be healed. That belongs to the human condition. And the idea that it can be dialectically overcome is a fantasy. What I like about Patočka is that even though he believes that telos in which you find meaning and truth and overcome alienation, even though it can't be reached, that there is still meaning in the seeking, in the pursuit of that horizon. And he has this idea, and I'll mention here one of Patočka's ideas and one of Shestov's ideas. As some of you know, I've presently been very preoccupied with Lev Shestov. Patočka has this idea called negative Platonism. And he looks at, the gap that Plato sees, and Viktoras will be able to speak to this better than I can, because he also knows Plato better than I can, of the empirical actually existing world, and this ideal world of Platonic ideals or Platonic forms. And there's always this gap. There's the empirical instance of the chair, and there's the ideal chair. And Patočka says, he doesn't believe in getting to that ideal. But Patočka says there's this thing that for Plato is horismos. I don't even know how to pronounce that in the Greek, but maybe somebody else does. This horismos, which is the gap, that space between the empirical and the ideal. And Patočka's philosophical move is to make that horismos, make that separateness the thing itself. And say it's that space, it's that separateness, that lack of identicality that is in fact our space of freedom. And that's our space of striving. That allows us to go beyond the empirical, to strive beyond the empirical, without a kind of dialectical sublation into the ideal. And that we have to value that space, which is our space of freedom, even though it can never be an achievement of that perfection in which the difference between the empirical and ideal is effaced. There's no way to efface that distinction. But precisely that space for striving from one to the other is where we have freedom as human beings to seek meaning and to find meaning. So I want to put that on the table because I find it an inspiring concept, because I don't want to leave us with very pessimistic concepts. And I also want to mention something else that, as poor Viktoras, who's been subjected to listening to me talk a lot lately, knows, I've been obsessing about Lev Shestov, who, as Shestov knows, is one of my favorite philosophers. And I've been thinking about him newly. I discovered Shestov through Husserl, as Husserl's interlocutor. That's how I came across him. But now, in the past 2.5 years, since the full-scale invasion, I've been thinking about what it means, for Shestov, whose hometown was Kiev, what it means to reread him again in these circumstances. And Shestov was a very dialogical thinker. He liked to think with other people. He liked to think in some sense in partnership. They could be alive, they could be dead, but he very much fits the seminar that we've long been conducting with Slavko and Shestov and Tim on Čitanje drugego, reading the other. He liked to think through reading the other. And he spent a lot of time reading Nietzsche, a lot of time reading Dostoevsky, and then later, in the last 10 years of his life, actually because of Husserl, reading Kierkegaard. And he became especially preoccupied with Kierkegaard's reading of the book of Job in the Bible. And what Shestov saw in Kierkegaard's reading of Job was that Job was a way out of Hegel. Because Job is the story in which the individual and individual suffering is not aufgehoben. It's not dialectically synthesized. It's not made okay. He talks about, what this teleological suspension of the ethical. For Hegel, the ethical is the universal, and the individual and the singular can ultimately be sacrificed and find its higher meaning in the whole. And what Shestov sees in his reading of Kierkegaard's reading of Job is that Job is this affirmation of the irreducibility of individual suffering. That can't be compared or sublated, or dialectically reconciled or made to overcome. That has to be taken in its singularity and has to be acknowledged in its singularity and not given some kind of higher purpose. And for Shestov, who was, in a way, of all of these characters I write about in my Eternally Unfinished Phenomenology book, I think he was the best human being. He was capable of deep friendship. He was very generous. He was not somebody who just lived by himself and ignored other people. But he felt very strongly about the singular and the individual, about something that could not be magically kind of aufgehoben into the whole in such a way as to be overcome, that the singular always had to be preserved. And I think of that now as well, both because we're talking about, is there an ideal Central Europe versus an empirical Central Europe? The Europe, I think, that was at stake on the Maidan was always in some ways very much an ideal Europe. It was a Europe more European than the actually existing Europe. Vasil Cherepanin writes in one of his essays about how the Maidan was too European for the EU. And I think that's actually it's a very perceptive comment. There was a kind of almost Platonic essence of what Europe should be if it would reach its ideal. So together with this, how we work with the gap between the empirical and the ideal in the notion of Europe and the notion of Central Europe, I want to put on the table how we work with the relationship between the singular and the universal as it relates to suffering. And as Viktoras knows, I tried in my delicate way, which may or may not have been effective. I was asked to speak to Jewish students at Yale at a time when, some of you may know that American campuses right now are in a state of a lot of turmoil, and there's been quite a bit of violence, not so much at Yale, but at other campuses. There have been massive protests about the war in Gaza, and a lot of people with a lot of strong feelings, and a lot of students who are very distraught, and a lot of friendships that have broken up, and a lot of people taking very maximalist positions, with the sense that suffering can be used in such a way as to, justify overcoming other things or ignoring other things. And what I was trying to gently suggest to the Jewish students, and I would have suggested the same thing to the Jewish students, I should say, represent a very wide spectrum of positions. In fact, all possible positions. And one of the things that's so painful for that community is how it's broken up. And so one of the things I was somehow charged to do was try to talk to some of them together, who are not necessarily on the same side, was to begin with a kind of acknowledgement of the irreducibility of individual suffering, which is not comparable, which can't be dialectically overcome and taken to a higher purpose, that needs to be acknowledged for what it is in every single case. To start with that acknowledgement of what is irreducibly individual, with some kind of recognition and respect, for that in each individual case. Now, where that leaves us in terms of whether anything ever can be dialectically overcome, I don't know. But the last thing I'll say is an idea I wrote about in this essay, which was completely taken from Shestov, that I keep now talking about because I find it inspiring and I need to cling to anything that is potentially inspiring. But Shestov has talked about the we need a new language in these apocalyptic times. We need a new language to talk about violence, and we need a new language to talk about suffering, because the language is stale. And then you get a rhetorical inflation, but you don't necessarily get a better feel for the granular nature of individual suffering. And Shestov's idea was that we need to adopt in all our languages the word perimoha, which is different from the word victory in English. It's different from pobieda in Russian. It's different from zwycięstwo in Polish. And that the literal meaning of perimoha, the para as the crossing, and the moha as the I can, the idea of going beyond what you can do, going beyond the empirical and beyond the singular, not necessarily in some way that reaches some kind of pre-given holistic telos, but in a way that is this kind of constant striving to go beyond. I find that very Patočkian in a way, and I find it something to hold on to, and something Ukrainians have given us. Or I keep using that phrase now, Pisla Perimohi, as if it were an English phrase and everybody should know it. So I will perhaps end with this idea of Perimoha, and how we can possibly get there in this grotesquely imperfect world. And maybe Viktoras will have some ideas.
It's a hard act to follow, Marsi, as usual. But I'm also very, very happy to be here. It's always a pleasure to visit Ukraine. Also, it's strange to say that it's a pleasure because also I haven't understood it yet fully, but I also feel some strange honor to be present in Ukraine in recent times. So I'm grateful to the organizers and to everyone who invited me. I'm also happy to report that Lithuanian word for victory has exactly the same connotations as Ukrainian word perimoga. Pergalė means exactly the same. It's about pergalė. So galėti is to be able, and pergalėti is somehow to go beyond the being able. So I was not aware of that, and there's some connection between Ukrainians and Lithuanians, and it's been proven again. But what I would like to talk about today, responding also to what Marci said and to yesterday's discussions, I thought, I would like to take as a starting point yet again Kundera's essay, but just one little aspect of it, where he talks about, which perhaps a crucial aspect, where he talks about Central Europe as being kidnapped from the West. And it's kind of, if you will, a foundational myth of Central Europe. Because with Kundera's essay, it's this very notion of Central Europe is articulated, at least for the contemporary debates. And so Central Europe is kidnapped, and in that way also kind of emerges, because it becomes separate from Europe. So there was this Europe, beautiful Europe, and these bad guys from the East kidnapped part of Europe, and that's how it emerged. The Central Europe, very unique. And it's curious to me, and I was thinking about it. So it's a foundational myth which is very clearly connected to a violent event, because being kidnapped is violence, isn't it? So I was living a peaceful life, having a coffee somewhere in Vienna, and suddenly someone came and kidnapped me. And it's not just a violent event. We would call it nowadays, I think, a traumatic event. Traumatic, and yesterday we spoke about it, about the traumas in this beautiful panel, about the traumas that haunt us. And I think it's important to stay a little bit. So we use this word trauma. What does that mean? And I really like the distinction, which I don't know if he came up with it, but I found it in him, this contemporary philosopher Richard Kiene. So he says trauma is different from a wound because a wound doesn't have lasting effects. So a wound heals, and it's like it's never been there. So if you cut yourself, you have a wound, but it will heal, and there will be no sign of it. While with trauma, it's different. It has lasting effects. So if you have a serious trauma, it will never go away. It will become part of your body, if it's a physical trauma, or part of your consciousness, of your identity, if it's a psychological trauma. And yeah, I mean, everyone who at least tried to engage in sports and had any trauma knows, you know. I remember reading an article about this professional basketball player who retired rather early, 30-something, because of the traumas. Because of the trauma, he had too many of them, and his body was basically broken. So it was not wounds, they were traumas. And we know that also about, you know, soldiers coming from war zone. They have post-traumatic stress disorder because they have to learn somehow to live with that. And so the thing about traumas to keep in mind, they will not go away like wounds. You know, in Russian there's the saying, "До свадьбы заживет." So trauma will not. A wound will, but trauma will. So it will stay there. And I'm no expert in disability, but from my experience, when I try to speak to people who have physical disability, is the ones who learn to live with the trauma, to accept it somehow, to accept that it's part of their life, manage somehow to move on also. It seems that's a way. And those who try to deny or somehow say, well, it's not there, or it has somehow to disappear, seem to have more issues. And so it seems to me, especially if we talk about traumas that become part of our identity, is even more important. So let's say I might have a trauma, but yes, it will stay with me, but it's not part of my identity. But we can have traumas that are exactly that formed me. And I think when Kundera talks about kidnapped Central Europe, it's a foundational myth. Actually, the myth of Europe itself is a myth of violence. You know, Europe was kidnapped and raped, if I remember correctly. And that's what we know about it. That's the first thing we know about Europe, is that it was traumatized. And that's how it emerged in our consciousness. If I could share my personal story, you know, for Lithuanians of my generation, the event that is, I don't know, sacred is not even a right word, but is of course January 13, 1991, when Soviet tanks came and took the TV station, etc., and there was a huge risk that they will take the parliament, etc. I was 10 years old at the time, but I remember that night, and I remember I was going that night to a TV station in Kaunas, which started broadcasting when Vilnius TV station was taken over. And I remember I knew quite clearly that I'm not coming back. And that was the mood in Lithuania, that we all are somehow going to die. So it was clearly an extremely traumatic event for the whole nation, and certainly not something that a 10-year-old child should experience. And at the same time, why I'm saying this, because of course it's somehow foundational about my own personality. So why I'm trying to say it, because there's this really strange connection. You know that I wouldn't wish that on my son. At the same time, I would never exchange that experience for anything, because it's what made me what I am. And so it's so strange to deal with that. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that traumas can be something that you kind of despise, and at the same time you cannot give up, because that's what you are. And of course, in psychology, nowadays you would call, not being able to deal with your trauma, you would call something, personality disorder. There's a clinical term. I'm not making it up. It's psychologists. We know that. We deal with that every day. It's personality disorder, and there are many forms of it. And since Marci mentioned Kierkegaard, whom I admire a lot, I would like to suggest his take on the personality disorders. He wrote this little book, which is called Sickness Unto Death, where he suggests a kind of typology of having a wrong relation to oneself. And he calls it, all of these misrelations to oneself, he calls despair. But there are various forms of despair. So he says one form of despair, the most primitive, the most boring, if you will, is not being even aware that you have a self. So you exist, but you don't have a consciousness of yourself. I think the first that comes to my mind as an example of that, I don't know if any one of you read that, I'm pretty sure some did. There's a novel by Kyrgyz writer Chingiz Aytmatov, A Day Lasts 100 Years. And he talks about what's called mankurte. So the persons that are completely disposed of the consciousness of self. And I think, by the way, that novel just begs to be reread in post-colonial terms, although it's written in Soviet times, but it's a fantastic novel. But also, so we all can think of beings like that, of course. Golem is a being that exists but has no self-consciousness. Yeah, I think, of course, it's tricky, but when we all ask ourselves about Russian population and this kind of complete lack of agency or subjectivity that Marci spoke about, is it also, you think, there's no self in there. There's no, in this great play by a great play by Tom Stoppard called Coast of Utopia, about the 19th century Russian revolutionaries. And there's a great dialogue, I really like it, where someone says to Belinsky, to this literary critic, says, I think Yersin says, we Russians haven't contributed anything to the world of ideas. We have not a single original idea. And Belinsky starts screaming, no, we have one, and it's intelligentsia. So intellect...
Which is German term.
Well, but, it's a play, but so intelligentsia, like the intellectuals as a class, as a social class. I was thinking yesterday about it, and I thought what they really contributed to political philosophy is the term bourgeois. And bourgeois is a really specific term, so in the Western world you have masses. For example, Ortega y Gasset writes about the revolt of the masses. So masses are really these people that have no individuality. Yeah, masses got together, and this whole selfhood is lost.
Zombie.
Yeah? It's kind of zombie. But still, Ortega y Gasset, when he writes about these mass, and he's quite snobbish about it, it's a great book, especially if you're young and you feel very smart, so then all of the others are stupid. But still, the level of despise, is that the word which this term Boudelot contains?
Contempt.
Yeah, contempt, exactly. Is unparalleled. And this is a normal term in Russian political discourse. So Boudelot basically, I don't know if everyone knows that, but it's basically just the population, like this really low lives, but it's just a synonym of population nowadays. And but anyway, so that's a form of despair, a very strange one, where you're not even aware that you have a self. But I think more interesting ones, what Kierkegaard speaks about, is and most kind of sophisticated when you're aware that you have a self, where he says there's a form of despair where you desperately do not want to be yourself. When you desperately do not want to be yourself. So whom do you want to be? Of course, someone else. So when there's, I don't know, a teenage girl and she wants to be like Taylor Swift, or an Eastern European that wants to be like Western European. Yeah? And we can all think of examples. I think it's pretty easy. When you feel like there's something wrong with me and I need to be someone else. Someone else, yeah, I have to imitate and learn.
Somewhere else.
And somewhere else, perhaps. I think in one of the readings we have, Rain Rout, he talks about provincialism, which is, of course, a form of that despair. Kierkegaard calls it weakness, despair out of weakness. You feel weak, and so you think that you will become someone by leaving yourself behind. But there's an even more sophisticated form of despair, when you desperately want to be yourself. And that form of despair he calls defiance, when you just decide that nothing else matters. It's only me, and I'm just there, and the world will have to deal with it. And that, I admit, even to me, I struggle to think of good examples for that form of despair. But I think we intuitively feel that it exists. And so for Kierkegaard, the way out of despair, out of this, is he has this strange formula. And of course for him at the end it's all religion, but we're not going to go there. But he says, to get out of despair is to relate yourself to yourself, but also to stand transparently in what he calls in the power that established you. So for him, it's of course God. But I'm thinking, so to go back to Central Europe, the power that established me is of course history. History and perhaps politics. And so to me, to get out of this not wanting to be Central Eastern European, and at the same time to want to be too much Central and Eastern European and saying the world can go to hell, is precisely to recognize that it's all some form of a process. Yes, we are dealt this strange card of history and geography, and there is no beginning, but there's also no one particular end. It's just us trying to be ourselves, which is at the same time trying to be Europeans. So to have aspirations is not always, my point is, to have aspirations is not always just fantasy. It's something that you have to embrace, but at the same time understand that you're not living in an empty space. You have all the baggage that will have to go with you. All your traumas, they can't be discarded. They're part of what or who you are. I'll stop here, maybe.